Same.
Charlie challenged me to debate him back when he was getting started. He said he wanted to debate whether Jesus was a socialist. Jesus lived in the first century,
Right.
and best I understand it, socialism came along about
Right.
1900 years later. So
He probably wasn't.
we probably won't get very far on that. I said, but if you want to have a public conversation about Jesus, I said, I'll be there. And then he backed off and didn't want to have the conversation anymore. So in so many ways.
All right. Well, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. Wow. This has been probably a long time coming, to be frank with you. It's great to have you on the podcast. You're a spiritual writer, a preacher, and community cultivator. You serve as the assistant director for partnerships and fellowships at Yale University Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. Perfect. It's like I thought about who would be a good guest to help us think about political and civic engagement as Christians that looks different than how a lot of us grew up. So it's great to have you. Thanks for making time.
Hey, it's what we're here for. Good to be with you.
Why don't you kind of give us just a very brief introduction to yourself? I mean, how did you fall into the work that you're doing now? Did you grow up in a more evangelical Christian environment? Maybe it was different. I would love to hear some of that.
Well, I'm a son of North Carolina's hill country. I come from hillbilly people, southeastern Appalachia. My people are all from southwestern Virginia and the border of North Carolina. Actually, my family's only real claim to fame is that my mama's people all grew up in Mount Airy, North Carolina, which is the original Mayberry. If any of you have ever watched the reruns of the Andy Griffith Show, that's where my mama's people come from. So when Andy wrote that story, he didn't bother to change the names of the people he'd grown up with. So our Uncle Otis was the town drunk in that show. That's our claim to fame.
Wow. Okay.
So at any rate, that's my people. I grew up there in the 1980s and 90s in the Southern Baptist Church, and that our local Baptist church was a real community and home for my parents. Met Jesus there, sort of found a community that supported and loved us well, and I was really grateful to be part of it. I also, looking back now, realized that I grew up at the moment when communities like ours were targeted by the religious right to be recruited into a political movement. So I was not aware of this at the time, but I was growing up, in the midst of those forces and wanted to do everything that I could for Jesus. So as a teenager, I thought that meant I needed to become president of the United States. And I set out on that path. Jimmy Carter had done it, so I thought I would follow in his footsteps. I wanted to go to the U.S. Naval Academy. You couldn't go to the Naval Academy without a recommendation from a U.S. senator, and I didn't know any. So my grandfather drove a Greyhound bus, and he gave me a ride to Washington, D.C. I went to the U.S. Senate back then, before 9/11, before all the security protocols, you could just walk in. I walked into the observation gallery and I saw young people like me walking around down on the floor. I said to a security guard, "Who are those people?" And he said, "They're Senate pages." And I said, that's going to be my first step. So I went to the Senate at 16 years old to page for Strom Thurmond. And that was kind of my intro into U.S. politics.
Wow. So you've been, okay, I didn't know that. So that's a pretty powerful story. I mean, you feel this, desire or calling, whatever you want to call it, and you just walk into the federal building that has all the senators and say, I'm going to do this. So you've been in politics then in some capacity for a very long time. Yeah.
I mean, this has been, so I wanted to be a part of politics, wanted to be involved from that perspective of, what I now understand to be a very, very distorted vision of political engagement. It was really, the religious right at that time had been shaped around the whole traditional values narrative. That was the language that the moral majority had used to recruit people like me. So I thought that someone like Strom Thurmond represented the same values that I had learned in Sunday school. That was the narrative. It turned out that was not true. There was a deep tension between, the basic things Jesus said and what my Sunday school teachers had taught me and what was actually being practiced in the name of our faith. And so as a 16-year-old, I kind of had a crisis of faith, a realization that, what I thought I was doing in Jesus' name wasn't, in fact, it didn't line up. And so I came back to North Carolina, my home, looking for another way to put my faith into practice in public life, and was really given the gift at that moment in my life of meeting Reverend William Barber, who I still work with today at the center. And he introduced me to another Southern tradition of faith and politics being woven together, but in the tradition of what he calls moral fusion. These are the people who came together after the Civil War to establish public education for everyone in the South. These are the people who built the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the labor movement in this country. And so I have been my whole adult life trying to root and ground myself in that tradition of public theology.
A lot of what you said, I think a lot of people listening have discovered themselves being in the same spot only many years later, right? Because as you know, and this is also part of my story, for me, when Trump really came on the scene, that was the beginning of me thinking, I've already had some kind of reservations about the evangelical tradition I was growing up in. I didn't understand why we were always waging war on Starbucks during Christmas time, things that I just found annoying. But Trump was a moment where I went, something feels really out of place here, right? Because to your point, and I say this often, the Sunday school teachers that I met that taught me about this Jesus person that I found so compelling as a young person, it seemed to be really at odds with the political engagement and the ways and the rhetoric and the moral compass that was being implemented in my conservative evangelical, political spaces. And so a lot of people, as you know, because you've been around the block more than I have, right? You've seen the waves of people kind of having that realization, and then it kind of crests and it comes back up. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of encouraging to know that even back then, when the moral majority was really at its peak of in power, there were people like yourself who maybe got involved and then realized, wait, something is wrong. What was that like for you? I mean, you said you were 16, so you were a young person, but was that really jarring for you to realize, like, oh my gosh, I thought we were on the same page here and something is just way wrong?
It was jarring. I mean, it was an experience that, as much as it made me rethink my faith, it also concretized my faith in a powerful way, because in my own experience, I feel like God intervened to save me. I'll tell you a very specific story that happened. I was working in the office on Capitol Hill, and I would often go down to the Union Station train station for lunch. They have a food court there in the basement, if you've ever been there. We got a lunch break. I'd go down there. I was walking down there, and one day a man asked me if I could spare some change. Now, as a kid, in my suit, sort of steeped in this tradition, we had all kinds of narratives for, why you needed to distinguish between the so-called deserving and undeserving poor, why, responding to someone like that, would be potentially enabling and this kind of thing. And all that stuff was in my head. So I ignored the guy and I kept going into Union Station. But when I reached out to grab those doors are really big. They have these big metal handles on them. And when I reached out to grab the handle, I heard Jesus speak to me in the King James Version that I had memorized in Sunday school. And Jesus said, inasmuch as ye did not do it unto the least of these, my brethren, ye did not do it unto me. And, my people did teach me that when Jesus speaks, you have to listen. So I turned around that day and I went back and tried to talk to the guy. I'm just trying to make sense of what's happening here. And in a lot of ways, that interruption was the sort of beginning of rethinking what I had been taught about what it means to live out faith in public. So it took a while. I literally didn't have resources to read the tradition differently. I had only been exposed to sort of one particular way of understanding
that
things.
That sounds so familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. So the second great gift, I mean, the first gift was an interruption. The second great gift was being welcomed into a tradition and realizing that people have been reading the Bible differently. I mean, in some ways, realizing that what I was in was a kind of aberration, actually,
Yeah.
of the tradition, and
Right.
that there was a long, tradition of public theology and a different tradition in my own context of people, living very close to me who I didn't know who read the Bible differently.
Well, that's an important thread to pull out here because as I've been doing my own quote unquote deconstruction, learning new terms like decolonization, just thinking differently about my faith. And I've been
Mhm.
exposed to more people than I ever have been before, more theologians and ways of thinking about the Bible. I mean, one of the greatest assets of having the internet at our fingertips is that you can find all kinds of biblical scholars from all different traditions really giving perspective, right? And you're like, whoa, this house is so much bigger than I thought.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because I am persuaded that more so than ever, that at least the particular tradition I was a part of was drawing on a legacy that did seem to be an aberration of, like, dare I use the phrase, historic Christian teachings on social issues and how we love our neighbors, etc. And it's
Yeah.
weird because when you grow up that way and your mind is formed that way, it feels like that's actually the only normal way to read the Bible. It's a real weird thing that happens to how your brain interprets this stuff. And I
Yeah.
think the hard work of rewiring your brain to see things differently is difficult. But once you do, it to your point, it tends to make so much sense. I mean, one thing I just did this the other day. I had this realization. I was thinking about, as we know now, the new Democratic ticket is Harris Waltz. Waltz kind of storms onto the national scene for the first time. And I'm looking at his policies. He's a Lutheran, devoted Lutheran. And this guy's like, yeah, how about free student lunches for all students, including private school students, if they opt in, by the way, or $1 billion housing initiatives to help get unsheltered people actually housed. Or he was the first person at his high school who was part of the Gay Straight Alliance as like an overseer. And I'm like, these things tend to add up with like just the Sermon on the Mount beatitude way of thinking of, feed the hungry. And he instituted, for example, paid family sick leave, right? Take care of the sick. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that, Tim is bringing God back to America. That's not the categories I operate in. But when it comes to someone claiming to follow or be a little Jesus, those policies seem to make a lot more sense than, hey, we have to defund all that stuff. Hey, less gun regulation. Hey, more anti-trans bills in our state legislatures. So it is interesting because it just feels so. I'm not sure. I'm kind of struggling for the words to describe it, but it feels like, right, of course that makes more sense. Why did I not believe that for so long? Right? It's a mind twist.
To know that it's part of a tradition. Tim Waltz doesn't exist on his own. There's a Paul
Yes.
Wellstone in the background. When everybody does better, everybody does better. This is a way of being Christian in public that has existed in the history of the United States. It's deeply rooted in the legacy of someone like Francis Perkins. If you ever walk through Washington, D.C., you walk by the Department of Labor. The building is named after Frances Perkins. Most people don't know who she was. Frances Perkins was the first woman to be a labor secretary. She was appointed by FDR. When she was appointed, she said that she took the job to put her Christianity into practice, to insist that people have a minimum wage. We have a minimum wage in the country because of Frances Perkins' Christianity. We have Social Security because of someone like this who said, old people shouldn't die in poverty if we are a Christian society, if we're people who want to, live out our values. So yeah, this is a tradition that has existed and that we can tap into. And I think that's incredibly important. It's important to know that there's something beyond, the very narrow world that some of us grew up in.
Exactly.
And it's also important. I'll just say quickly, it's also important. It's also important. And this has taken me a while to understand. It's important not to demonize the people that we grew up around, and to recognize that in so many ways, we were subject to an incredibly well-funded propaganda campaign.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of this came, at least my disposition toward it, comes from right after the experience I described to you in Washington, D.C., after I'd come back to North Carolina, after I'd begun to kind of learn that there were other paths. I finished high school in Germany as an exchange student with something called the Congress Bundestag program. The U.S. government pays for American high school students to study in Germany every year, and has since the end of World War II. And the German Bundestag does the same. It's a kind of a soft diplomacy program to try to prevent world wars and such. But in my case, it meant that I lived with a family, the grandfather of which happened to be the mayor of our town. And I'll never forget, at Christmas dinner the year I was there, talking to this grandfather, who's very involved in local politics in Germany, about his life and where he had been during World War II. And he wept as he explained to me that he had been a member of the Hitlerjugend, the organization that Hitler's supporters founded in order to raise up young people in a kind of nationalism that would support what Hitler was doing. He was part of that, like me, because he seriously wanted to serve his community and be patriotic, and in his mind to be Christian, and he had to come to reckon with after the war was over the fact that he had been brainwashed and had to see from people who came from the outside to reveal what had happened in his country, how much he had been led astray. I mean, I think obviously the situations are different, but the more people learn about the organizations around the religious right, about the formation of the Council for National Policy, about the way that those organizations were used to create a wraparound culture that was not just about what was happening and being said in church, but also what the local media was saying, what radio was saying, what politicians were saying in our communities, that we were subject to a propaganda campaign that made it very difficult to know what the truth was. And so a part of my own journey has been really committing with others, as part of organizations to trying to build some culture in rural America that offers Christians and, people who are not part of the church, but are just part of the local culture, some alternative organizations to be part of. Because I think like you were saying earlier, there are a lot of people who've always felt uncomfortable with some of the more extreme things that come out of the leadership of these groups. But the reality on the ground has been that there's been very little to be part of apart from the organizations that these people have controlled. And so I think that's an important piece of understanding what's happened to our country.
I couldn't agree with you more. We have a very strong policy against non-dehumanization for this exact reason, right? Because once you start demonizing the other as the other, you kind of start participating in the same cycles that you try to escape from in the beginning. And I agree. And you have to use wisdom, because there are times where I think about the leadership of these organizations versus the rank and file. One of the things that I go to often, every year I go to Turning Point America's America Fest. It's 14,000 people. It's all the big names. It's the biggest, I call it the biggest Christian nationalist event in the country. And I go there. I'm going back in December. This would be my third year going in a row. And I always notice a huge disparity between the people on the platform and the people who are leading this stuff versus people I talk to who are just like, I care about the country and, I want to try and save America. I found that when I talk to them one-on-one over drinks or food, we can find a lot more common ground. I mean, one example is I was talking to a woman last time I was there. I had no clue who she was, just some attendee. We hit it off at the bar and we're talking. And before you know it, I was able to ask her, so why are you here? And she gave a lot of the typical points. Oh, I really care about America. I want to save the country. And before you know it, we're both agreeing that maybe affordable health care for all people could be a good idea, or maybe student loan forgiveness could be a good idea. And I'm like, okay, so we actually have some common ground here. So where's the discrepancy, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that, especially because we're on the same planet with these other folks, and obviously neither of us are going to ever advocate for violence to be used towards those people. We have to think about how do we make this work together that actually promotes the common good for all of us, right? And I found a massive delta between the Charlie Kirks of the world, who are on the stage saying some of the craziest, most dehumanizing and arguably white supremacist things that I've heard in a long time, versus the people who go to these events and are like, well, maybe I wasn't a fan when you said that, but I think the overall idea of Save America is powerful, right? There's a real delta there.
Yeah, and these folks are invited into narratives that are designed to pit us, one side against the other.
Right.
Even Brother Charlie Kirk got drawn into that. I followed him from early on. Charlie challenged me to debate him back when he was getting started. He made a public challenge. He was under the umbrella of an organization that Jerry Falwell had at his university before he had his great fall. And anyway, in his capacity there, he issued this public challenge to debate. And I said, what he wanted to debate was, again, this is kind of a way of seeing the way these kind of wedge issues work. He said he wanted to debate whether Jesus was a socialist. And I said, well, Jesus lived in the first century, right. And best I understand it, socialism came along about 1900 years later. So
he probably wasn't.
we probably won't get very far on that. I said, but if you want to have a public conversation about Jesus, I said, I'll be there. And then he backed off and didn't want to have the conversation anymore. So in so many ways, this whole movement was born and has sort of formed these ways of creating these wedge issues. They chose abortion in the beginning because they thought it could be a wedge issue. And one after another, these wedge issues have kind of been sort of ways of saying you have to choose which side you're on. And what I hear you saying is that, like all human experience, when we talk to people, we often recognize that, we're all more complicated than that. And yes. I think any sort of Christian vision of the human predicament says that, it's not the good guys versus the bad guys. We've got the good and the bad all wrapped in us. And that's the whole point of the story. It's why we need to be saved, but it's also why we have to have sort of processes in our public life that allow, as Lincoln once said, that better angels of our nature to come through, and these scarier parts of who we are and who we can be to be constrained. And in so many ways, I think that's why in this moment we need as broad a coalition as possible that's committed to democracy, because democracy is the best way we've found to sort of rein in that the worst impulses we have. And we have a two-party system in this country, but we have one party that has really capitulated to anti-democratic forces. And I think that means that people within that party and that is the Republican Party, and certainly Democrats and independents, have to unite around a vision of having a democracy where we can share a conversation about what the best ways are to pursue the common good, because there's a real possibility that we could lose that whole structure. And in many ways, that's what I see this extreme movement in the country pushing toward.
This is a very important point, because I have talked to some people, I can't say who for confidentiality, I can tell you offline, but some people who are definitely conservative, evangelical, major leaders in that space. And I've talked to them privately, and we all agree we need a democracy to still be able to argue in when all is said and done, right? I'm like, yes, like I can get behind that, right? And so I agree with you. Here's my question, and this is really where I think people like you, the wisdom that you have based on your experience and knowledge, and also you being steeped in a Christian tradition that seems much more compelling than I have been. You mentioned something that, like to the effect of like, it's not about like we're all good or bad, we're kind of complicated. I totally, on principle, I get that. I really do. And I certainly don't want to pretend, okay, that like in our country, the Democratic Party is the party that's going to save America, right, from the evil, vile Republicans. I don't like those kinds of binaries, because I have major problems with that party as well, in particular with how they've handled the genocide of the Palestinians, etc. However, okay, with the caveat, I look at someone, we'll just use Trump as an example, because he's really Trump and what I call Trumpism have taken over the RNC over the past decade, right? I mean, Mitt Romney was the last candidate for the RNC, and now he didn't even go to the recent Republican National Convention. He's been totally kicked out of his own party because he's seen as a rhino, Republican in name only.
Yeah.
Someone like Trump, when he comes along, I really struggle with thinking about any good that man has inside of him, that is advocating for a better society for Americans. From what I can tell after following him, deeply studying the movement, the people around him, I just see a consistent pattern of dehumanization, a consistent pattern of lies, of narcissism. I mean, literally, I have a book to give you an example of how crazy things are. This book is a real book. It's called Christ Trump. Okay. It's Christ Trump, Persecution of a Man. This book argues that if Jesus lived past age 33, he would be just like Donald Trump. And it's not satire. So I look at this stuff and I go, in our current cultural moment, reading the room, one side of our political process seems incredibly far gone and not redeemable as it stands. And I don't know what we do with that as Christians who are called to love our enemies, who are called to the nonviolent way of Jesus, who are called to invite people into a better way of being. Where do you draw the line between this leader cannot be tolerated, this leader cannot be welcomed into these spaces, versus we're still Christians who want to bring the kingdom on earth and invite everyone, even Trump, to repent, to do better? Yeah. Help me understand how you think about this, because this is the riddle in my head that I cannot wrap my head around.
Well, we have in the Christian tradition a long string of stories that warn us against idolatry. I mean, go all the way back to Israel in the wilderness. You know, you've got people who've been set free from bondage, you know, by God, the liberator. And the moment they're kind of overwhelmed by their fears, they want to create some sort of idol that they can worship, and by worshiping that idol, to sort of be able to assuage fear and to project power, right? That's what idolatry does. It's a kind of collective projection of the power that we want to be in control so that we don't have to be afraid. I think that happens with someone like Trump, and he's in a position, of course, to benefit both personally and politically from that kind of projection. And so what you find is that leaders like that exploit the people who have often very, decent reasons to be afraid for themselves and their own futures. So, I mean, just to kind of bring this home to the moment we're in, Reverend Barber and I wrote a book this year called White Poverty that is about the fact that poverty in the United States is a crisis that hasn't been addressed. It hasn't been addressed by Republicans or Democrats. Yep. And over the last 40 years, many rural white communities have actually suffered worse from the accelerating consequences of that poverty. And in raw numbers, there are more poor white people in this country than there are black or brown people, which is not by any means to say that racism isn't still very real, but it is a reflection of the fact that the poor white people have been represented, rural poor white people have by and large been represented by political leaders who have sold them out, right? So we're talking about, Appalachia, where I'm from. We're talking about Eastern Kentucky. We're talking about West Virginia. We're talking about places where people have been represented by folks who claimed, to talk about their values and who played to their fears, who sort of played into this sort of dynamic of idolatry that we're talking about. And then when they got power, used that power to cut corporate taxes, to give deals where corporations could, in many cases in Kentucky, sell the company to multinational the partners that then didn't have to fulfill the pension and healthcare requirements that the companies had previously guaranteed to folks who got black lung while they were in the mines doing the work for decades. So all that to say, these communities have reason to be angry. They have reasons to be afraid, not just for their personal future, but for their communities. And these politicians come in and exploit that, and then use it to further benefit themselves and their corporate donors. I mean, that's a very real consequence of the dynamic that we're talking about. And I think if you are a Christian who opposes idolatry, then what you have to do is say that, people who have exploited that have to be exposed. They don't need to be in power. It wouldn't be loving to pretend that, that they should be in that position, or they should continue using people. You don't have to demonize them, but you do have to say, I pray for Brother Donald Trump that he can be saved before he has to, cross over from this life to the next. And I think essential to his own soul's salvation will be him getting out of these positions where he can believe that he's some kind of savior to other people. I think it's a very dangerous position for those people, but also for somebody who steps into that role.
This is actually a very important point, white poverty, because you're right. I mean, you're completely correct. And I think about MLK's, right, Poor People's Campaign, the idea of like, hey, we're in this together. The poverty does not know the color of someone's skin. It's just people are poor for all kinds of reasons, and it transcends the racial divide that we've often seen. And I do think, to be fair, and I will probably get at least one angry email about this for not being factual, but I hold this position. I do think that by and large, the Democratic coastal elites, so to speak, have really overlooked that aspect, right, of poverty. And they really haven't let people in those spaces know that, no, we actually care about you and want to think about what are better ways of and systems and bringing jobs, et cetera, to these communities to raise your standard of living. So I do think there's definitely some culpability there for sure, at least broadly speaking. Hi friends, if you're enjoying this video, I have a favor to ask. The New Evangelicals is a 501c3 nonprofit, and if you've looked around at all, you've probably noticed that we don't offer member subscriptions on YouTube or Patreon options. The reason for this is very simple. It's been our mission since the beginning to offer all of our content and community resources completely paywall free. What this means is that we are completely dependent on the generosity of people like you who donate to make this work possible and accessible for all. If our content has helped you, would you consider donating to keep it all going? You can find the link in the description of this video, and to be very clear, this is not about giving to God or something like that. We're not a church and this is not a tithe. The ask is so simple. If our work has helped you, would you be willing to help us make this content accessible to more and more people? All donations made in the US are tax deductible and every bit helps. Thank you for your generosity. I think what I'm struggling with is, we have this term Christian nationalism. I struggle with the language of how we combat it. I'm not a big fan of using violent language. I don't like saying we have to destroy Christian nationalism. It just sounds, for me, a little too much like the warlike rhetoric that I've grown up hearing. Dr. Roberto Espinoza says that we have to compost supremacy. I love that idea, the idea of composting something, Yeah. And so that to me sounds like a better option. For you, based on just your experience and you being in this work for so long, I'm sure you're looking at what's in front of us and you're saying, okay, you've seen this kind of thing before. How do we as Christians resist that's what I use, Christian nationalism, in ways that can be effective for the sake of all of our neighbors? Like, how do you think about that when you see Charlie Kirk and you see this massive right-wing media empire that espouses this stuff led by Trump, who is, so problematic for so many reasons? What do you think is the Christian response to this?
Well, my take has been that we should always lean into a better vision of Christianity and invite folks to join it. I mean, it's helpful, I suppose, to point out that this is a exploitation and a corruption of Christian faith. But that, by itself, and in many ways, that's all that anybody did with regard to the religious right for a long time. And the effectiveness of that movement was that they kept investing money in building organization, particularly in rural America, so that so that while there were always people saying, well, that's not real Christianity, or that's not my Christianity. Nevertheless, the people who were showing up were often people who were advocating this. Now, they had a lot of oil money. They had a lot of people who were invested in it for the wrong reasons. So, in many ways, I'm not saying that it was simply a decision people made between, are we going to allocate resources here or there? I mean, it's without a doubt that whole movement has had a disproportionate amount of resources. Nevertheless, I think Christians, the church, should take some responsibility for the fact that we haven't invested in building a vibrant and inviting form of Christian community, of beloved community in so many places where all people have is churches that have either capitulated to this or have so privatized faith, so as to say, we're going to try to keep people's personal relationship and their family relationships going, but we're not going to touch this political stuff because it's too divisive. That creates a dynamic where the only voices in public life, the only voices speaking about moral issues in so many communities, have been ones that have played into this very narrow narrative that the organizations of the religious right created.
What do you say to people? I'm sure you've heard this, and they say, Jonathan, you're just a Christian nationalist on the other side of the aisle. You're just trying to make America Christian again in your own liberal, Marxist, socialist way. How do you respond to that critique? I'm sure you've heard it before. And how do you separate the world of the Christian nationalist movement versus what you're saying is a very faithful tradition of civic and political engagement as Christians in America?
Yeah. Well, I think what Christian nationalism does is it makes the mistake of believing that you can use the power of the state to implement a religious vision. That's what my Baptist ancestors warned against. That's where the whole separation of church and state comes from in the American tradition. The alternative, I think, which is a sort of I think a realistic view of the role that religion plays in human culture, is to say it's impossible to practice really most any faith without it having implications for how we live our life in the world and how we want the world to work. So of course, everyone's faith informs, what kind of common life they want to pursue. But everyone should have an opportunity to advocate for that, with a sort of equal power, one person, one vote. And that's kind of how a democracy works. So I think the biggest argument against me being a sort of Christian nationalist with a different vision would just be to say, well, I work a lot with my Muslim neighbors, with my Jewish neighbors, with my neighbors who aren't of any particular faith, but who, share my own hopes for what we can have in our community, and working together, regardless of our backgrounds, is the work of building coalitions in a democracy for a society where everyone can do well.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally trying to find the common good, right? Because people often, I'll get sometimes someone in my DMs who thinks I'm just off the rails, and they'll make that accusation. And what I say often is, well, first off, Christian nationalism has a very specific definition. Like, there are people who have done the work to help define these terms. But ultimately, Christian nationalism wants to privilege itself at the expense of our neighbors. That doesn't mean that we don't think that you can be a Christian and engage in political policies and advocate for certain things, but what are we actually advocating for? Who benefits? Who doesn't? Who stays at the top? Who stays at the bottom? That's what separates a Christian nationalist, I think, ideal versus the things that you're arguing for, or the tradition of MLK that Reverend Barber's a part of, etc. It's yes, our faith animates us. That's why I do this work. That's why you do your work. But it animates us to want to give away, at least for me, as a white cis man, whatever privilege I have for the sake of the other, bringing them up instead of saying, no, you stay down so my rights can trample over yours. That's a huge distinction that I think oftentimes goes overlooked. And because of this, I don't know, you tell me, you're the expert here, not me, but the way I kind of put this together is I see two major movements in particularly white evangelical spaces. I see this hardline Christian nationalist trajectory that a lot of people have kind of hopped on board for, many megachurch pastors, et cetera, not all, but many. And then I see this other tradition of the white moderate, the safe white moderate, the both sides. Well, we don't want to be extremists. We just want to preach the gospel. And at first, I think I used to be kind of there, back in the day. Now I'm like, oh man, like we're just repeating the same critique that MLK gave his white pastor friends of being this moderate who won't take a side, who won't stand up for the oppressed for the sake of coming across as extreme. It's very interesting to witness that, I think, in 2024.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. We do have to engage, and we, in a sense, we do have to take a side, not in the way that the culture wars have tried to put us on one side or another,
right.
But we have to choose to be for the people who are suffering. We have to choose to be for democracy. We have to choose to be for a society where people can maintain freedoms in the context where, we do have a political movement that wants to impose its will on people, whether the majority of people support it or not. I mean, one of the sociologists who does regular surveys on Christian nationalism, my friend Robbie Jones at the PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. And what he's tracked over the last few years is how, the percentage of people who are willing to say, that they believe that it may be that they have to use violence to impose their political vision. Yeah. That number has dramatically increased, particularly among folks who affiliate with Christian nationalism. Yeah. So we have a movement that has so persuaded people that their fears of how the country, is changing or how they perceive it to be changing, their fears are justification for a kind of violent defense of their power. That's a dangerous place to be in. And anybody who has studied autocratic movements, will tell you that when you have any movement where a large number of people believe that, it becomes incredibly dangerous to democracy, even when it's not a majority, because this way of negotiating life together depends on people's willingness to rely on the structures of nonviolent, change of power and such, and that can be interrupted by a relatively small number of people.
People like yourself, I think, have such wisdom to offer to people like myself who are new. Right? I mean, I started TNE. It's going to be 4 years ago in December, so I'm very much a baby, trying to understand and kind of get my bearings on what was I a part of, what Jesus did I give my allegiance to, and how does that have to shift going forward. And so, folks like yourself, Shane Claiborne, Reverend Barber, many others, have, I think, a real opportunity to kind of, dare I use some evangelicalese here, but disciple people, right, into a different way of being Christian. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to ask you it now, is you've seen much more than I have. You've been in a different space a lot longer than I have been. In your estimation, this current iteration of Christian nationalism that we're seeing, how serious is it compared to like the moral majority or something else like that, right? Because I grew up on talk radio. So that meant that a lot of my days, I was just told 24/7 how Obama and the Democrats are destroying the country and we just have days left to live, et cetera. And I don't want to repeat that hyperbolic type of attitude by saying Christian nationalism is the single greatest threat to democracy, if it's not true, right? If I'm being extreme. So I'm kind of curious, as someone who has a lot more experience in this department than I do, where do you place the threat to democracy or the threat of Christian nationalism compared to other iterations of this movement?
Well, it's a good question. And I've had the conversation quite a bit with, with my mentors, people, who I've learned from, but also with historians.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that I have good friends who risked their lives to challenge Christian nationalism in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, Christian nationalism was a driving force behind the resistance to the Civil Rights Movement. And I know people who, were stabbed, who were beaten, who had guns put in their faces. Those friends, now in their 80s, tell me that they're more concerned now than they were then. And they're more concerned now because they see the institutions of the Republican Party, of a national party, embracing this more so than any national party did at that time. The historians I talk to say that along those lines, this kind of political movement that's willing to embrace violence has not had the kind of political support that it does since the 1850s in this country. And that's concerning because, of course, that was right before the Civil War. So I think it's a very concerning time. And I think we have learned, we can learn from our past that there really only is one way forward if we want a peaceful country where all of us can do well. And that includes, the people who are embracing Christian nationalism and who, have their fears and concerns that are driving their willingness to embrace this. I don't think it's possible to convince a lot of those people right now that, Trump is not their great hope or that they shouldn't support this. I do think it's possible to democratically build a coalition that can outvote them. And I think we should do that, not only for our sake, but also for theirs.
I have interviewed a lot of people over the past 3 years, and it's a real privilege to have people of your caliber and others like you who are able to give their expertise and just knowledge of what they know. And that is, whenever I ask that question, that's pretty much the answer I get. And I say that because I want the audience to know that, whenever I'm on Instagram saying that Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy we've ever seen, I want them to know that I'm not making that up, right? Like, I'm not just pulling ideas out of my butt and like, oh, I don't like conservatives anymore, so look, the greatest threat we've ever seen. That's not what this is about. We want to be as data-based as we can. We want to rely on the expertise of historians and folks who have been to places that we're not. And I agree with you. I mean, it's interesting because there's kind of two things happening here in our cultural moment. You're right. I mean, the RNC being essentially captured by this MAGA populist Christian nationalist movement is really something to behold. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, spoke at Nick Fuentes's alt-right white supremacist rally 2.5 years ago. And for those who don't know, Nick Fuentes is, this is not hyperbolic. He denies the Holocaust. We're like that level of insanity, wants only a white race to flourish. He critiqued J.D. Vance as a pick because his wife is Hindu, okay? She spoke at his conference a few years ago. She initially defended it. She finally walked back the comments a few months later, but Trump has also gotten dinner with Nick Fuentes. And when he was told about who he was, he didn't apologize. He just said, well, I didn't know who he was, so too bad, so sad. these are the people who are at the top of the RNC, period. Marjorie Taylor Greene spoke at the RNC convention. Trump is the Republican nominee for president. So that should really tell us something. When David Duke, a KKK former Grand Wizard, says, Trump is my guy. Oh, great job, Tucker Carlson, talking about the Great Replacement Theory on the air. That should give us all pause. But in the spaces I grew up in white evangelicalism, it hasn't. And so I agree with you. I do think that we are really at a crux. However, I think the other side of this is, and this is me, again, just being kind of opining on some of my own thoughts of what I've experienced. I do think that we are witnessing a serious shift among former evangelicals, new evangelicals, red letter Christians, whatever. We're witnessing a shift among people who grew up like that and who are like, no, like something is really not right here. We have to think differently about how we vote and what we're advocating for as a Christian population. So I'm hopeful. I do feel like Kamala and Tim as a ticket could actually really invigorate people to think differently for the first time in a long time. But I agree. I mean, we're in some pretty hot water, and the billionaires behind the funding of these things and the power that they bought, despite it not being popular among most people, the policies, it's something that we have to be aware of.
And I think for people who want to make a difference, it's worth looking closely at, where can we have influence,
right?
And where is the greatest potential for change. I think it's always worth a conversation with our, fellow Christians about how they're going to engage and how they're going to vote in future elections. Yeah. I also think that the degree to which we can change people's minds, especially in the short term, is relatively small. But the work we've been doing with the Poor People's Campaign is about recognizing that just in the number of low-income people who have not participated in our election, we have far and away more than we need in order to not only win national elections, but to win places that are presumed to be so-called red states. So we're actively with the Poor People's Campaign reaching out to 15 million low-income voters who didn't participate in the last election, wow, but who, like you're saying, might have a lot of reason to turn out for not just a Harris Waltz ticket, but for local kinds of races where people are willing to embrace, things like raising the minimum wage to a living wage, or investing in affordable housing, or paid family leave and child income tax credits. These are issues that matter at the state level. They matter at the congressional representative level, and also at the top of the ticket in presidential races. So we're reaching out to people around an agenda that matters to low income people, and not even making it a partisan issue, but saying, if there were people speaking to your issues, would you turn out, and informing people about what the options are in this election. I think that kind of outreach really can make a difference in terms of who shows up and what kind of coalition exists to vote for democracy.
Are you looking for volunteers to help out with that? Can people sign up on a website to get involved, to help make those calls or do whatever it is?
Yeah, anywhere in the country. So the Poor People's Campaign is organized through state coordinating committees. So if you go to poorpeoplescampaign.org, you can connect with your state's coordinating committee and sign up to get trained for that kind of outreach.
Well, listen, friends, I get asked this every day. What can I do to help? How can I help? There you go. I've handed to you on a silver platter a way you can directly help push out people to vote this election, which, by the way, friends, if you're not registered to vote yet, you better get registered. We are putting a link in our show notes and YouTube description every single episode that we post to register to vote. So make sure you do that. But yes, that would be great. Go to thepoorpeoplescampaign.com, sign up to volunteer to help be part of the change that you want to see. Jonathan,
and if you're a Jesus person, Jesus's first sermon was quoting the prophet Isaiah, good news to the poor. His last sermon was the one that was ingrained in my memory that I mentioned earlier, whatever you did unto the least of these, you did it unto me. This notion that how we treat the poor is literally how we treat Jesus, how we treat God.
Yes.
So if you're a Jesus person and you're thinking about voting, then this concern for the poor, not just policies that impact the poor, but also what kind of voice poor people have in our society, I think is a central issue. And the Poor People's Campaign is trying to give folks a way to make that connection.
I love that. Listen, Jonathan, it's been a true pleasure to have you on the podcast to offer your expertise. Please don't be a stranger. We have a lot of work to do, both publicly and behind the scenes, so we'll keep in touch. If folks want to follow your work personally, are you online? Are you on the socials? Plug all of your channels for us.
Yeah, you can find me. My name, JonathanWilsonHartgrove.com, is a website, and I continue to engage the social media on the site formerly known as Twitter.
Regretfully, so do I. Well, listen, keep in touch. It was great having you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Blessings.